Dominic Rossi was a ghost in the Chicago underworld, a man who built a ruthless, untouchable empire on silence and absolute loyalty. He was a monster to his enemies, but to his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, he was just Dad. After the brutal murder of his wife, Dominic's mansion became a heavily guarded fortress, and trust became a currency he no longer spent. When Clara, a soft-spoken nanny, brought life back into his grieving daughter's eyes, Dominic thought he had finally found peace. But in his world, peace is an illusion. He fired Clara coldly and without explanation, believing he was excising a traitor. It wasn't until he found his daughter crying in the dark that she whispered a secret about her nanny. A truth so devastating, it brought the city's most feared crime boss to his knees in tears. The Rossi estate sat on 30 acres of isolated land just outside the city limits of Chicago, surrounded by 10-foot wrought iron fences, motion sensors, and heavily armed guards patrolling the perimeter. It was less of a home and more of a compound. To the FBI, it was the nerve center of the largest organized crime syndicate in the Midwest. To Dominic Rossi, it was a prison he had built to keep his only daughter safe. Ever since the car bomb that took the life of his wife, Sophia, 2 years prior, Dominic's heart had calcified. He became merciless in his business, expanding his territory with a brutal efficiency that left rival families in ruins. But inside the mahogany-lined walls of his home, he was failing. 6-year-old Lily hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since her mother's closed casket funeral. The trauma had locked her inside her own mind, leaving her a hollow shell of the vibrant, laughing child she once was. Dominic had hired and fired a dozen nannies. Some were too intimidated by the armed men in the hallways. Others were too clinical, treating Lily like a patient rather than a grieving child. Then came Clara Bennett. Clara was 26, with unassuming brown hair, a quiet demeanor, and a resume that Silas Mercer, Dominic's ruthless and paranoid underboss, had vetted a dozen times over. There was nothing remarkable about Clara on paper. She had grown up in the foster system, put herself through college working night shifts, and had a degree in early childhood development. She had no ties to the police, no criminal record, and no family to leverage against her. From the moment Clara stepped into the Rossi compound, things began to shift. She didn't flinch when heavily tattooed men walked past her in the kitchen. She didn't ask questions about the black SUVs that came and went at all hours of the night. Her entire world was focused entirely on Lily. Dominic watched from the shadows of his second-floor study as Clara worked her slow, patient magic. At first, Lily ignored her, staring blankly out the reinforced glass windows of her playroom. But Clara didn't push. She simply sat on the floor nearby, reading fairy tales aloud, painting, or humming soft melodies. By the third week, Dominic checked the security cameras and saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Lily was sitting next to Clara, her small head resting on the nanny's shoulder, helping her turn the pages of a book. For the next 6 months, the gloomy, oppressive atmosphere of the Rossi estate was pierced by small rays of light. Clara taught Lily how to bake cookies, ignoring the stern glares of the kitchen staff. She took her out to the heavily guarded gardens to catch fireflies. She was fiercely protective of the girl, once stepping between Lily and one of Dominic's captains, who had accidentally raised his voice while arguing in the hallway. Dominic found himself feeling a strange, unsettling gratitude toward Clara. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, money, power, his life, Clara seemed to only want to see his daughter smile. Sometimes, late at night, Dominic would run into her in the kitchen, getting a glass of water. They would share a brief, quiet conversation. He noticed her sharp intelligence, her quiet strength, and the way she never seemed afraid of him. But in the Mafia, vulnerability is a death sentence. And Dominic was about to be reminded that in his house, nothing pure was allowed to survive. The shift happened just as winter began to freeze the sprawling lawns of the estate. Dominic's syndicate was under heavy fire. A shipment of untraceable weapons, worth millions, was intercepted by the feds at the docks. 2 of his best lieutenants were arrested in a raid that was far too precise to be a coincidence. There was a rat in the family. Someone was leaking high-level operational details to the authorities. Paranoia descended upon the compound like a thick fog. Silas Mercer, a man who had been Dominic's right hand for a decade, took charge of rooting out the mole. Silas was a gaunt, cold-eyed man who trusted absolutely no one. He began interrogating the soldiers, reviewing security footage, and tapping the phones of his own men. One evening, Dominic was pouring himself a glass of scotch in his study when Silas entered, sliding a manila folder onto the heavy oak desk. "We have a problem, boss," Silas said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "It's the girl, the nanny." Dominic stiffened, his hand freezing on the crystal decanter. "Clara, don't be ridiculous. She barely knows what city we're in." "I thought so too," Silas replied smoothly, leaning forward. "But look at the logs." Dominic opened the folder. Inside were security printouts and phone records. Silas pointed a long, bony finger at the documents. "The night the docks were raided. She was out of her room at 2 a.m. Camera 4 shows her walking near the east wing, right by your private office." 2 days later, a burner phone pinged from inside the estate, connecting to a number traced back to a federal task force. "We swept the staff quarters today while she was out with Lily in the garden." Silas dropped a cheap, black, prepaid cell phone onto the desk. "We found it taped under the mattress in her room." Dominic stared at the phone, his heart turning to lead. The betrayal sliced through him deeper than a knife. He had let this woman near his daughter. He had let his guard down. The evidence was right in front of him. "She's playing you, Dom," Silas whispered. "She used the kid to get close. You know the protocol. Give me the word, and she disappears tonight. No body, no evidence." Dominic looked at a framed photo of Lily on his desk. If Clara was a federal informant, killing her would bring the full wrath of the FBI down on his remaining operations. But letting her stay was impossible. The rage inside him boiled over, but when he pictured Lily's smile, a smile Clara had brought back from the dead, he couldn't give the order to end her life. "No," Dominic said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'll handle this my way." The next morning, Dominic summoned Clara to the main foyer. She arrived with a warm smile, holding a drawing Lily had just made. "Mr. Rossi, Lily wanted me to show you—" "Pack your bags," Dominic interrupted, his voice like cracking ice. Clara stopped, her smile fading. "Excuse me? You have 15 minutes to gather your things. A car is waiting outside. It will take you to the train station. You are leaving, and you are never coming back." Panic flashed in Clara's eyes. "Dominic, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Lily needs me. She's just starting to—" "Do not say my daughter's name," Dominic roared, stepping into her personal space, his towering frame casting a dark shadow over her. "You are lucky I am letting you walk out of this house breathing. If I ever see your face in this city again, if you ever try to contact Lily, I will show you exactly why they call me the Devil of Chicago. Now get out." Clara stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. She looked desperately down the hallway towards the nursery, then back at Dominic. She opened her mouth to speak, but the dead, murderous look in his eyes stopped her. Without another word, she turned and walked upstairs. 20 minutes later, the black SUV drove Clara Bennett off the estate. Dominic watched it leave, telling himself he had protected his family. He had no idea he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The aftermath of Clara's departure was immediate and catastrophic. When Lily woke up from her nap and found Clara gone, the house echoed with screams that tore at Dominic's soul. He tried to calm her, offering new toys, promising trips, explaining that Clara had to go away. But Lily wouldn't listen. She tore apart her playroom, threw her meals against the wall, and eventually, after 3 agonizing days, she retreated completely. The silence returned, heavier and darker than before. Lily stopped eating. She refused to leave her bed. She stared at the ceiling, her small face pale and gaunt, clutching a stuffed rabbit Clara had given her. Dominic was drowning in guilt and frustration. His empire was crumbling outside the walls. The leaks to the feds hadn't stopped, despite Clara being gone. And inside, his daughter was fading away. He hired 3 different highly recommended nannies in a week. Lily completely ignored them all. One rainy Tuesday night, a month after Clara was fired, Dominic sat on the edge of Lily's bed. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of a nightlight. He looked at his beautiful, broken daughter, feeling entirely powerless. All his money, all his lethal men, all his power, none of it could fix this. "Lily, please," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking, shedding the armor of the ruthless mob boss. "Please talk to Daddy. You have to eat something. I know you miss Clara, but she was a bad person. She lied to us. She was trying to hurt our family." For a long time, there was only the sound of rain against the bulletproof glass. Then, slowly, Lily turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were red and swollen, carrying an ancient kind of sorrow that no 6-year-old should possess. "She wasn't bad," Lily whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Dominic's breath hitched. She was speaking. "Sweetheart, you don't understand these things. She had secrets. She was taking things from Daddy's office." "She didn't take anything," Lily said, sitting up weakly, her tiny hands gripping the blankets. "Uncle Silas took the black book." Dominic froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "What?" "I couldn't sleep," Lily murmured, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I went to your office to find you. You weren't there. But Uncle Silas was. He was taking pictures of your papers with a little black phone. When he saw me, he got really mad." Dominic's heart hammered against his ribs. The burner phone, the missing ledger. "Silas. He grabbed my arm," Lily cried, pulling back her pajama sleeve to reveal a faint, yellowish bruise that Dominic had thought was from roughhousing. "He said, Dero, if I ever told you, he would make me go to sleep forever. Just like Mummy." Dominic felt the blood drain from his face. The world tilted violently. "Clara heard me crying," Lily continued, her voice trembling. "She came in and pushed him away. She told him to leave me alone. Uncle Silas told her that if she breathed a word to you, he would kill both of us. He said he would frame her." Lily looked up at her father, her eyes pleading. "Clara told me to pretend everything was normal. She said she would figure out a way to keep me safe. She was trying to protect me, Daddy. And then you made her go away." The realization hit Dominic with the force of a freight train. Clara wasn't the rat. Clara hadn't betrayed him. She had discovered Silas's treason and had silently borne the weight of a Mafia enforcer's death threats just to protect his little girl. She had been framed with the burner phone Silas planted, and Dominic, blinded by paranoia and Silas's poison, had thrown the only innocent person in his house to the wolves. Dominic covered his face with his heavy, calloused hands. The man who had ordered executions without a second thought, the man who controlled the city with an iron fist, broke down. Deep, agonizing sobs racked his chest. He had punished the savior and harbored the traitor. He pulled Lily into a desperate embrace, kissing the top of her head as tears streamed down his face. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry," Dominic choked out. "I'm going to fix this. I swear to you, I'm going to fix this." When Dominic stepped out of the nursery and closed the door, the sorrow in his eyes vanished, replaced by an inferno of pure, unadulterated rage. He pulled his heavy .45 caliber pistol from his shoulder holster. It was time to have a word with Silas. The transition from a weeping father to the devil of Chicago took less than 60 seconds. Dominic Rossi wiped the tears from his face, his jaw set so tightly that a muscle twitched beneath his skin. He didn't run. He didn't shout. The most dangerous thing about Dominic had always been his terrifying, methodical calm. He walked down the grand mahogany staircase of the estate, the heavy weight of his .45 caliber pistol comforting against his ribs. He bypassed the guards in the main hall, pulling out his encrypted phone to dial his most loyal captain, Tommy the Bull Russo. Tommy was old school, a man who had taken 2 bullets for Dominic's father, and whose loyalty was forged in blood, not money. "Tommy," Dominic said softly, his voice echoing in the empty, marble-floored corridor. "Bring 4 of your best men to the meatpacking plant on Halstead Street. And Tommy, disable Silas's access codes to the compound. Do it right now." "Done, boss. Is there a problem?" Tommy asked, his tone instantly shifting to business. "Silas is the leak," Dominic replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And he's going to learn what happens when you threaten my daughter." 30 minutes later, Dominic's black, armoured Mercedes G-Wagon pulled into the loading dock of Rossi Prime Cuts, the family's legitimate front in the West Loop. Silas Mercer was already there, reviewing export manifests in the glass-walled office overlooking the factory floor. He looked up, surprised, as Dominic entered, flanked by Tommy and 4 heavily armed soldiers. "Dom, what's going on?" Silas asked, his eyes darting to the men blocking the exit. His gaunt face remained strictly professional, but Dominic caught the microscopic flinch in his posture. "Sit down, Silas," Dominic ordered, pulling the blinds shut on the office windows. The metallic clack of the blinds echoing in the room sounded like the locking of a cell door. Silas slowly sank into his leather chair. "If this is about the feds sniffing around the Southside docks, I already told you. I'm handling the fallout." Before Silas could finish his sentence, Dominic crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbed Silas by the lapels of his tailored suit, and slammed him violently against the brick wall behind the desk. A framed map of Chicago shattered to the floor. "You threatened Lily," Dominic hissed, his voice dropping to a demonic register. He pressed his forearm into Silas's throat, cutting off his air. "You touched my little girl. You put your hands on her, and you threatened to put her in the ground next to her mother." Silas's eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He clawed at Dominic's arm, gasping for breath. The lie was over. He knew the kid had finally talked. Dominic released the pressure just enough for Silas to gasp. "The black book, Silas. You were photographing my ledgers for the FBI task force. You framed Clara Bennett to cover your own tracks. Give me one reason why Tommy shouldn't put you through the industrial meat grinder right now." Silas coughed, spitting blood onto the pristine floor. The rat was cornered, and the panic in his eyes morphed into a desperate, hateful sneer. "Because you went soft, Dom. Ever since Sophia died, you've been a ghost. You stopped pushing our territory. The Colombians are breathing down our necks in River North, and you're sitting at home playing house with a nanny. So you sold me out to the feds to take the throne," Dominic said, his voice deadly quiet. "I made a deal for immunity," Silas spat, clutching his bruised throat. "I give them you, and they let me take over the remnants of the operation. It was just business. But that nanny, she walked in on me. She saw the burner phone. She saw the ledger." Dominic's stomach twisted. "Where is Clara?" Silas let out a dark, ragged laugh. "You fired her, Dom. You threw her out on the street with no protection. But I couldn't risk her coming back or going to the cops. She knew too much, Dominic pressed the barrel of his .45 directly against Silas's forehead. "What did you do, Silas?" "I sent 2 of my own hitters after her train," Silas whispered, a sick smile creeping onto his face. "They've been tracking her since she left the compound. By now, she's probably at the bottom of the Chicago River. You're too late." Dominic struck Silas across the jaw with the butt of his pistol, dropping the traitor to the floor in a heap. "Take him to the basement," Dominic ordered Tommy, his chest heaving. "Don't kill him yet. If Clara is dead, I'm taking him apart, piece by piece myself." Dominic practically tore the door off its hinges as he rushed back to the G-Wagon. He grabbed his encrypted phone and dialed his syndicate's top hacker, a reclusive tech genius named Aris, who operated out of a reinforced bunker in Pilsen. "Aris, I need a trace, and I need it 5 minutes ago," Dominic commanded as the engine roared to life. "Clara Bennett. She was fired from the estate a month ago. Silas Mercer put a hit on her. Find her phone, her credit cards, facial recognition on city cameras. Find her." "Give me 60 seconds, boss," Aris replied, his keyboard clacking furiously in the background. Dominic merged onto Interstate 55, pushing the heavy SUV to 90 miles an hour as rain began to pound against the windshield. The guilt was eating him alive. Clara had sacrificed everything to protect Lily. She had endured his cruel words, his threats, and a Mafia death sentence, all without saying a word, just to ensure his daughter's safety. If she died because of his blind paranoia, Dominic knew he would never be able to look at Lily, or himself, ever again. "Got a hit," Aris's voice crackled over the speakers. "She's not in the city, Dom. She's been moving constantly, probably knew she was being followed. She used a debit card 20 minutes ago to pay for a room at the Starlight Inn, a rundown motel off Route 66, just outside of Joliet." "Are Silas's men there?" Dominic asked, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. "I'm hacking the motel's security feed now," Aris said, pausing. "Dom, a black Chevy Tahoe just pulled into the motel parking lot. 2 men, heavily armed. They were heading toward room 114. I'm 10 minutes away. Keep them on the line, Aris," Dominic shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. The speedometer needle buried itself past 100. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the dark, desolate stretch of highway. Every second felt like an eternity. Dominic visualized Clara, soft-spoken, kind-hearted Clara, who had baked cookies with his traumatized daughter, cowering in a cheap motel room while 2 ruthless killers approached her door. Tires squealed as Dominic took the Joliet exit, the heavy SUV drifting dangerously on the wet asphalt. He spotted the flickering neon sign of the Starlight Inn through the torrential rain. He threw the vehicle into park before it even fully stopped, kicking his door open into the storm. Rain instantly soaked his suit as he drew his weapon, his eyes scanning the dilapidated single-story building. He saw the black Tahoe parked near the end of the lot. Dominic sprinted toward room 114, his heart pounding in his ears louder than the thunder. The door to the room was already kicked open, the wood splintered around the lock. "Clara!" Dominic roared, stepping into the doorway, his gun raised. But just as he breached the threshold, a deafening gunshot rang out from inside the dark room, followed by the sound of a body hitting the floor. The smell of sulfur and cheap motel carpet hit Dominic first. The flickering blue light from the neon Starlight Inn sign outside cast long, jagged shadows across the walls of room 114. Dominic's eyes adjusted to the gloom in a fraction of a second. On the stained linoleum floor near the bathroom, a massive man in a dark trench coat was writhing, clutching a shattered kneecap. It was Garrett Davies, one of Silas's most ruthless enforcers. But it wasn't Garrett's gun that had fired. Backed into the far corner of the room, trapped between a broken dresser and the wall, was Clara. Her hair was soaked from the rain, her clothes rumpled and dirty from weeks of running. In her trembling, pale hands, she gripped a small, silver .38 caliber revolver, a cheap street weapon she must have bought out of pure desperation. Smoke was still curling lazily from the barrel. She had shot her attacker. But the nightmare wasn't over. The second hitman, a cold-eyed killer named Leon Fowler, was standing just 3 feet away from her. He hadn't noticed Dominic breach the doorway over the deafening crack of Clara's gunshot. Leon raised his suppressed 9mm pistol, aiming it directly at Clara's chest. "Little mistake, sweetheart," Leon sneered. Dominic didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. The devil of Chicago moved with the lethal, fluid grace that had built his empire. He raised his heavy .45, his vision tunneling until nothing existed but the space between Leon's eyes. Bang! Bang! 2 deafening shots roared in the confined space. Leon's body jerked violently forward and before collapsing backward over a shattered coffee table, instantly dead. Garrett, gasping in pain from his shattered knee, scrambled to reach his dropped weapon. Dominic closed the distance in 3 strides, his heavy leather boot coming down on Garrett's wrist with a sickening crunch. Garrett howled, but Dominic quickly silenced him with a brutal strike to the temple with the butt of his pistol. The room fell dead silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the broken window and Clara's ragged, hyperventilating breaths. Dominic lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. He turned to look at the woman he had so callously thrown to the wolves. Clara was pressed flat against the wall, her wide, terrified eyes darting from the dead man on the floor to Dominic. Her hands were shaking so violently that the little .38 revolver clattered from her grip, hitting the floorboards. She shrank away from him, pulling her knees to her chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and broken. "Dominic, please. Silas said... He said you sent them. He said you knew I took the ledger to keep it away from him. Please don't. I never told the police anything. I swear." The words struck Dominic like a physical blow. Silas hadn't just hunted her. He had poisoned her last weeks of freedom, making her believe the man whose daughter she had saved was the one trying to put her in the ground. Dominic immediately dropped his gun. He kicked it away, raising his empty hands to show he was unarmed. Slowly, deliberately, he dropped to his knees, right there in the blood and broken glass of the motel floor. "Clara," Dominic said, his voice completely stripped of its usual commanding iron. It was a raw, trembling sound. "I didn't send them. I swear on my life, I didn't send them." She stared at him, a tear cutting a clean line down her dirty cheek, terrified to believe him. "Lily spoke to me," Dominic continued, his voice cracking as the emotion finally overtook him. "She told me everything. She told me about the Black Book. She told me how Silas threatened her, and how you stepped in front of him. You saved my little girl, Clara. You saved my world. And I was too blind to see it." Clara let out a choked sob, her tough exterior finally shattering. The weeks of running, the terror, the isolation, it all crashed down on her at once. Dominic closed the remaining distance on his knees and pulled her into his arms. He wrapped his heavy, rain-soaked trench coat tightly around her trembling frame, shielding her from the cold and the carnage. Clara buried her face in his chest, weeping uncontrollably. "I've got you," Dominic whispered into her hair, his own tears mixing with the rain on his face. "You're safe now. No one is ever going to hurt you again. I promise you." The adrenaline was beginning to drain from Dominic's veins, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. The cramped, blood-spattered room of the Starlight Inn smelled sharply of gunpowder, copper, and damp earth. Dominic remained on his knees for a long time, holding Clara as she wept into the heavy, soaked fabric of his trench coat. For years, Dominic had been the architect of his own isolation. He had built walls of paranoia and violence so high that no light could penetrate them. Yet, here was this woman, a civilian, an outsider, a soft-spoken caretaker who had endured the full terror of his world just to keep a 6-year-old girl safe. "We need to move," Dominic finally whispered, his voice incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the deafening violence that had occupied the room just moments before. "The local police will have heard the shots. I won't let them take you into a precinct, Clara. Not tonight. You've been through enough." Clara nodded against his chest, her breath hitching. She allowed him to help her to her feet. Her legs were shaky, trembling from the horrific crash of surviving a near-death experience. Dominic kept a firm, protective arm around her waist, guiding her carefully past the shattered coffee table and the lifeless body of Leon Fowler. He didn't let her look down. He shielded her eyes from the carnage, a silent promise that she would never have to witness the brutality of his life ever again. Outside, the storm was beginning to break. The torrential downpour had reduced to a steady, melancholic drizzle, washing the blood from the asphalt of the motel parking lot. Dominic opened the heavy, armored passenger door of his black Mercedes G-Wagon and helped Clara inside. He turned up the heat, pulling a thick wool blanket from the back seat and draping it carefully over her shivering shoulders. Before getting into the driver's seat, Dominic walked over to the shattered window of room 114. He looked inside at Garrett, who was still groaning, clutching his ruined knee. Dominic didn't say a word. The sheer, empty menace in his dark eyes conveyed a promise of unimaginable suffering. He turned on his heel, climbed into the SUV, and put the vehicle in drive. The drive back to Chicago was shrouded in a heavy, contemplative silence. The rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers served as a metronome to the racing thoughts in Dominic's head. Clara had curled up in the passenger seat, her head resting against the cold glass of the window, wrapped tightly in the blanket. The exhaustion had finally claimed her, pulling her into a deep, restless sleep. Dominic drove with one hand resting easily on the steering wheel, the other instinctively hovering near the holster strapped to his ribs. He stole glances at her periodically, marveling at the quiet, unyielding strength disguised beneath her unassuming exterior. She had outsmarted a Mafia underboss, evaded trained hitmen for weeks, and stood her ground with a cheap revolver. She had done it all without a safety net, without a syndicate backing her, armed only with a fierce, maternal love for a child that wasn't even hers. As the imposing, illuminated skyline of Chicago came into view over the dark expanse of the highway, Dominic reached for his encrypted phone. He connected a secure call to his most trusted captain, Tommy the Bull Russo. "Yeah, boss." Tommy's gruff voice filled the quiet cabin of the SUV, slightly distorted by the encryption software. "Room 114 at the Starlight Inn off Route 66, Dominic said, keeping his voice to a low, gravelly whisper so as not to wake Clara. "Send a cleanup crew immediately. You have one dead on the floor, the other is Garrett Davies. He's alive, but his knee is shattered. Patch him up just enough to keep him breathing, then bring him to the warehouse. He doesn't get the luxury of a quick exit." "Consider the room spotless," Tommy replied smoothly. "And Silas? He's still strapped to the chair in the meatpacking basement. He's been screaming about his immunity deal with the feds for 3 hours. Says if he doesn't check in by morning, they'll raid the compound." Dominic's eyes darkened, reflecting the passing amber streetlights of the city. The mention of Silas's name sent a spike of pure, unadulterated hatred through his chest. Silas had been a brother to him. He had stood beside Dominic at Sophia's funeral, and all the while he had been plotting to dismantle the family from the inside out, willing to sacrifice Lily and Clara as collateral damage for his own ambition. "The feds don't have a warrant, and they don't have their star witness," Dominic said coldly. "Silas's deal died the second he put a target on my daughter's back. He wanted to be the untouchable foundation of this city's underworld. Let him be exactly that." Dominic paused, his grip tightening on the steering wheel until the leather creaked. "Take him to the new casino construction site we own in the South Loop. The crew is pouring the concrete for the central foundational pillars tonight. Strip him, bind him, and mix him into the pour. I want him awake when it happens. By sunrise, I never want to hear the name Silas Mercer spoken in my presence again." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, a testament to the chilling finality of the order. "It's done, Dom," Tommy finally said. "Welcome back." Dominic disconnected the call. The rat was dead. The Empire was secure once again. But as he looked over at Clara's sleeping form, illuminated briefly by the passing city lights, he realized that for the first time in 2 torturous years, the Empire wasn't what mattered most. The power, the territory, the millions of dollars in untraceable cash. It was all ash compared to the lives of the 2 people he loved. Dawn was just beginning to break over the choppy, grey waters of Lake Michigan when the heavy iron gates of the Rossi estate swung open to receive them. The storm had completely passed, leaving the sprawling, meticulously manicured lawns washed clean. The morning sun cast a soft, golden, forgiving glow over the imposing stone mansion. It looked less like a fortress now, and more like a home that had survived a long, bitter siege. Dominic parked the SUV near the front steps. He walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, and gently unbuckled Clara. She stirred, letting out a soft murmur of confusion, but she was too exhausted to wake fully. Dominic slid his arms under her knees and behind her back, lifting her effortlessly against his chest. He carried her up the stone steps, past the heavily armed guards flanking the grand double doors. The men, hardened killers who had seen decades of street warfare, immediately lowered their gazes in a rare show of absolute respect. Word had already spread through the ranks about what the nanny had done. In the Rossi syndicate, loyalty was the highest currency, and Clara Bennett was now the wealthiest person in the city. Dominic's heavy boots echoed softly on the marble floor of the grand foyer. The house was quiet, bathed in the tranquil, dusty light of early morning. He intended to carry her upstairs to the guest wing, to let her sleep for a week if she needed to. But as he reached the bottom of the grand mahogany staircase, a small, fragile voice rang out from the landing above. "Clara?" Dominic stopped dead in his tracks. Standing at the top of the stairs, wearing her oversized pink pajamas and clutching the worn-out stuffed rabbit Clara had given her, was Lily. Her large brown eyes were wide, welling with fresh tears as she looked down at her father, and then at the woman bundled in the blanket in his arms. Clara's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the girl's voice. The fog of exhaustion instantly evaporated, replaced by a sudden electric surge of adrenaline. She gasped, struggling slightly in Dominic's grip. Dominic immediately knelt down, setting her gently on her feet on the marble floor. "Lily," Clara breathed out, her voice cracking, completely ignoring the lingering pain in her bruised limbs. "Clara!" Lily screamed. It wasn't a cry of sorrow. It was a sound of pure, unrestrained joy that tore through the heavy silence of the mansion. The 6-year-old girl ran down the massive staircase as fast as her little legs could carry her, nearly tripping over the hem of her pajamas. Clara dropped to her knees on the cold marble, tossing the blanket aside, and caught the girl at the bottom step. She wrapped Lily in a fierce, desperate embrace, burying her face in the child's neck. Lily clung to her, sobbing openly, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of Clara's damp sweater. Clara rocked her back and forth, kissing the top of the girl's head over and over again, her own tears falling freely. "I'm here, sweetie. I'm right here," Clara cried, her voice muffled against Lily's hair. "I'm so sorry I was gone. I'm never leaving again. I promise you, I am never leaving you again." Dominic took a slow step back, giving them the space they needed. He leaned against the heavy wooden banister, watching the two most important people in his life holding on to each other as if they were the only things anchoring them to the earth. He felt a sharp, painful lump form in his throat, the heavy, suffocating darkness that had lived inside his chest, a parasite that had fed on his grief since the day his wife died. Finally fractured. The morning light poured into the cracks, warming him from the inside out. Hours later, evening had settled over the estate. The house was calm. Lily had finally fallen asleep in her own bed, her small hand firmly holding onto Clara's fingers until the very last second. Dominic found Clara in the estate's sprawling library. She had showered, washed the blood and dirt from her hair, and changed into a pair of comfortable sweatpants and an oversized cashmere sweater she had borrowed from the guest armoire. She was standing by the massive stone fireplace, staring thoughtfully into the crackling flames, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. "She went down without a fight," Dominic said softly, stepping into the room. Clara turned, offering a small, exhausted, but genuine smile. She ate a full dinner, too, 2 helpings of pasta. "She's incredibly resilient, Dominic. She's going to be okay." Dominic walked over to the antique crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured 2 fingers of aged bourbon into a heavy glass, debating whether to offer her one, but noticing her tea, he refrained. He took a slow sip, letting the familiar burn ground him, before walking over to join her by the fire. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had stood on the edge of the abyss together and managed to pull each other back. "I reviewed the security footage from the night you left," Dominic finally said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I saw Silas corner you in the hallway near the west wing. I saw him grab your arm. I saw the way you positioned yourself between him and the nursery door." Clara looked down at her tea. He was frantic. He couldn't find the ledger. He knew I had seen him with the burner phone the night before. He told me that if I went to you, he would make sure Lily was caught in the crossfire of the federal raid he was planning. "Why didn't you tell me, Clara?" Dominic asked, turning his head to look at her. The question wasn't an accusation. It was a desperate plea to understand her incredible sacrifice. "You could have come to me. I would have protected you." Clara met his gaze, her brown eyes remarkably steady. "Because you didn't trust me, Dominic. Not really. You are a man who has been betrayed by the world. If I had pointed a finger at your right-hand man without proof, Silas would have spun it. He would have convinced you I was the rat, and you would have believed him. And while you two were busy figuring out who was lying, Lily would have been vulnerable. I couldn't risk her. Taking the ledger and running..." It drew Silas's attention away from the house. It made him hunt me instead of focusing on his takeover. "It bought you time." Dominic stared at her, utterly floored by the tactical brilliance and the selfless courage of her actions. She had played a deadly game of chess with a Mafia underboss, using herself as the bait, simply to buy a father time to realize his house was on fire. "I owe you my daughter's life," Dominic said, his voice trembling with a rare, raw emotion. He set his bourbon glass down on the mantel and turned to face her fully. "I owe you my own life, Clara. I don't know how a man like me repays a debt like that. I can give you money. I can set you up anywhere in the world. I can give you a new identity, completely free from the shadows of my life." Clara looked up at him. She saw the heavy scars on his hands, the permanent tension in his shoulders, the dangerous life he led. But she also saw the man who had dropped his weapon and fallen to his knees on a bloody motel floor, crying tears of absolute relief. "I don't want your money, Dominic," Clara said softly, stepping just a fraction of an inch closer to him. "And I don't want a new identity." "Then what do you want?" Dominic whispered, the space between them suddenly feeling charged, pulling him in like gravity. Clara reached out, her small, warm hand resting gently against his chest, right over his heart. "I want to stay. Not as an employee. Not as someone you hired to fix a broken house. I want to stay because I love her. And because I believe there is more to this family than just the darkness you've convinced yourself you deserve." Dominic looked down at her, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't in years. He realized then that Clara Bennett was no longer just the caretaker of his child. She was the heart of the home he had almost destroyed. She was the light he had spent 2 years trying to shut out. "My world is dangerous," Dominic murmured, a final, weak attempt to warn her away from the fire. "I know," Clara smiled, her eyes shining with an unbreakable resolve. "But I also know the man who protects it." Dominic slowly reached up, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, marveling at the reality of her standing there with him. He leaned in, closing the distance, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead, sealing a silent vow. "Then stay," Dominic whispered against her skin. "Stay, and let me spend the rest of my life protecting you, the way you protected her." The ghost of Chicago had finally found his soul, and as the fire crackled warmly in the quiet library, Dominic Rossi knew, with absolute certainty, that his family was finally whole. 6 months had passed since the night the Chicago sky wept over the Starlight Inn. The sprawling Rossi estate, once a suffocating fortress built on grief and paranoia, had undergone a quiet but profound transformation. The heavily armed guards still patrolled the perimeter, and the 10-foot wrought iron fences still stood tall against the encroaching world. But the air inside the mahogany-lined halls had changed. The oppressive silence that had haunted Dominic's home had been chased away by the sound of a little girl's laughter. Dominic Rossi sat at the head of a massive oak table in the dimly lit basement of Rossi Prime Cuts. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and expensive espresso. Seated around him were the heads of the 4 remaining crime families in the Midwest. Among them was Vincent Pagano, a ruthless, old-school mobster who had been eyeing Dominic's territory ever since the rumors of Silas Mercer's disappearance hit the streets. "You've been quiet, Dom," Vincent rasped, taking a slow drag from his cigar. "Word on the street is you've lost your edge, that you're pulling back from the ports, that you're going legitimate." Dominic leaned back in his leather chair, the heavy gold watch on his wrist catching the dim light. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The terrifying, methodical calm of the Devil of Chicago still commanded the room. "I'm not pulling back, Vincent. I'm evolving," Dominic stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The ports are too hot. The feds are swarming the docks because of a rat problem that I have since eradicated. We are moving our operations into real estate development, casinos, and high-level tech logistics. The old ways, the street corners, the petty extortion, the sloppy hits, they are over. Any man at this table who continues to draw federal heat to our city will answer to me personally." Vincent scoffed, leaning forward. "And if we decide we don't like this new direction? What then, Dom? You going to send your new nanny after us?" The temperature in the room plummeted. The other bosses visibly stiffened, recognizing the fatal mistake Vincent had just made. Tommy the Bull Russo, standing by the door, instinctively rested his hand on the butt of his holstered weapon. Dominic didn't blink. He slowly stood up, bracing his massive, scarred hands on the oak table. He leaned across the wood until he was inches from Vincent's face. The terrifying, soulless void that had once defined Dominic's existence flared to life in his dark eyes. "The woman you are referring to is the mother of my child in every way that matters," Dominic whispered, his tone laced with absolute venom. "If you ever speak of her again, Vincent, I won't just take your territory. I will dismantle your entire bloodline. I will erase your name from this city so completely that your own ghosts will forget who you were. Do we have an understanding?" Vincent swallowed hard, the cigar trembling slightly between his fingers. He looked into Dominic's eyes and saw exactly what Silas Mercer had seen in his final moments, a man who had finally found something worth destroying the world to protect. "Understood, Dom," Vincent muttered, averting his gaze. "Just business." "Good," Dominic said, straightening his suit jacket and turning his back on the most dangerous men in the city. "Meeting adjourned." An hour later, Dominic's armored G-Wagon pulled through the reinforced gates of the Rossi compound. As he stepped out of the vehicle, the tension in his shoulders immediately began to melt away. He left the Devil of Chicago in the driveway and walked into his home as just Dominic. He found them in the sunroom at the back of the estate. The afternoon light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Clara was sitting on a plush rug, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, laughing brightly as Lily attempted to build a towering, structurally unsound castle out of wooden blocks. Dominic paused in the doorway, simply watching them. Clara had brought a vibrancy back to his world that he had thought was buried forever with his late wife. She had refused the lavish gifts he tried to shower her with, demanding only honesty and safety. She had become his anchor, grounding him when the darkness of his world threatened to pull him under. Lily looked up and spotted him, her face lit up with pure joy. "Daddy!" She scrambled up from the rug and ran toward him. Dominic dropped to one knee, catching his daughter and spinning her around, burying his face in her hair. She smelled like vanilla and sunshine, a stark, beautiful contrast to the cigar smoke and danger he had just left behind. Clara smiled, standing up and dusting off her jeans. She walked over to him, her eyes soft and full of an unspoken understanding. Dominic stood up, keeping Lily balanced on his hip, and wrapped his free arm around Clara's waist, pulling her close. He kissed her forehead gently. "How was the meeting?" Clara asked softly, resting her hand on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "Boring," Dominic lied smoothly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Just a bunch of old men talking about the weather. What did you two do today?" "We made a fortress," Lily declared proudly, pointing at the wobbly wooden blocks, "but Clara said it needs more windows so the light can get in." Dominic looked over at the little wooden castle, then down at Clara. The profound symbolism wasn't lost on him. He tightened his arm around her, resting his chin on the top of her head as they stood together in the sunlit room. "She's right," Dominic murmured, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable peace. "Every fortress needs a little light." In a world ruled by deception, power, and violence, it was the quiet courage of a nanny that brought the devil of Chicago to his knees and saved a broken family. Dominic Rossi learned the hard way that true loyalty isn't bought with fear. It's earned through sacrifice. If this thrilling saga of betrayal, mafia justice, and unexpected love kept you hooked until the very last second, please smash that like button. We want to hear from you. What was your favorite twist, and did you think Clara was going to survive that motel shootout? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this incredible story with your friends who love high-stakes drama, and hit that subscribe button with the notification bell turned on. We have plenty more heart-pounding, real-life inspired stories coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one.